I think that the normalization of violence and evacuations and chaos in the learning environment is also happening among the youngest learners. Many students are not going home and saying, my classroom was evacuated for the 50th time this year.
On Closer Look with Michael Friscoletti, our editor-in-chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith, Derek Turner, as always, at the helm. You know what? I was having a bit of a proud moment this morning.
Tell me about it.
I will tell you about it.
Please.
For those who don't know, and here's a little, peek behind the curtain, part of our daily ritual when we come in is, going through various websites and researching and getting prepared for that evening's show. Mm-hmm. And, it occurred to me, we're pretty fortunate here. 27 websites across the province of Ontario, the Trillium, the largest bureau at Queen's Park, and a lot of talented journalists within our circle.
Yeah, we take for granted. It's a good point. Just the great local journalism we're doing across the province, right? And I obviously read our stuff every day because that's my job.
Yeah.
But it's phenomenal because what could be happening in, let's say, Guelph, for example, is completely different than what's happening in Barrie.
Yeah. But
our reporters there are covering the local stories that matter. Even just this morning, just going on our sites. Richard Vivian in Guelph, he's one of our reporters in Guelph, has a powerful story about a local landlord there that's actually been given jail time in connection with a fatal fire. There were 2 people tragically killed in a fire a couple of years ago, and there was convictions in provincial offences court regarding lack of smoke alarms. Given 50 days in jail, this landlord, which is so rare. I think I can remember one other time where a landlord has gone to jail in Ontario for something like an egregious violation that they didn't do. Yeah. I think Jenny Lamudd in Sudbury, one of our reporters there, wrote a piece about a Sudbury family that was in the Toronto area at a hotel.
In North York,
And some guy tried to break into their room and got the door open. And then the fight between the dad and this guy for many minutes, and then how the young boy phoned 911 as his dad was fighting this guy. And I could tell you that story is it's scary in so many ways. We've all been to hotel rooms with for hockey tournaments for our kids or just wherever. And you just never know people knocking on the door. What was crazy about that story is it obviously resonated with people around the province because it ran on a lot of our sites, and just people are reading that story like crazy.
And you're right. We've all been in that position. In a hotel room, flipping the latch across and wondering, is that enough?
Especially with the hockey tournament, the kids are just knick-knocking the whole time. You think, somebody, what's going on? But it was a crazy story. It's just crazy to see how many people have been reading that piece. And then even just this morning in the Sioux, we've talked about this on the show before. Last Easter, there was a young kid here, a young hockey player named Connor Dunn. He was 15 years old, tragically was killed by an alleged drunk driver.
Right.
And it just devastated the whole community because he was well known. He was not just a great hockey player, but a good kid. And, well liked by people at his high school and had many friends. Just one of those kids, right, that just lit up a room when he walked in. And it's been almost a year since he passed away. And the local junior hockey teams here, like he played for the Sioux Junior Greyhounds.
Right.
And the couple of the teams got together and had kind of an exhibition game. They swapped teams or swapped players for the 2 different age groups. And they raised his jersey to the rafters at one of our arenas here, number 19 in the red and white. And it was a pretty emotional moment. And Greg McGrath Gowdy, one of our reporters here in the Sioux, covered it last night. And it was just a beautiful story. Just talking to, the league, the head of the league about why they did this event, talking to coaches who coached him, other friends, and just really capturing what was a pretty packed house. A lot of people in the community just wanted to be there for this family. So, this is stuff we're doing every day, Scott. Like
every day.
And I know it's easy to take it for granted because you log on to whatever your local news site is every day, and there it is, just our journalism at work, 24 hours a day. It's there. If something's happened in the community, you can log on to our sites and you're going to get the best information possible on what's happening. And so I'm glad you mentioned that because we do take it for granted.
We do. And you know what? I think that the 3 of us have the best part of the job is we get to come in here each night and talk about the great stuff.
Yeah, because a lot of times their reporting is what is on this show. We have them on the show. We talk about the issues that they're covering. So it's we could show people it every day because we do fantastic work.
All right. 27 local news sites across the province. Check one out close to you. And, of course, the Trillium. the largest bureau at Queen's Park. That in itself is impressive.
Yeah.
Okay, to tonight's program, violence in Ontario schools on the rise.
Yeah, you talk about the Trillium as an issue they've covered quite well over the last few months. There's been a lot of reports lately just about the increasing violence in Ontario schools. If you talk to a teacher who's currently in that position, you hear the anecdotal stories about just how things have changed in the last 20 years in schools. We did an episode on it back in September with a couple leading experts on the issue. One was a union representative, one was a researcher, just talking about what we know about the numbers and the stats and why it's getting so bad. And then today, the OACTA, which represents Catholic teachers across Ontario, they put out another report today just talking about how violence has become the, quote, new normal in classrooms across the province. Students and teachers have the right to learn and work in a safe and healthy environment, yet too often that basic expectation is not being met. The report is called A System Under Strain, Violence and Harassment in Ontario Schools, and it's a pretty eye-opening report. Some of the stats, like 9 in 10 teachers have experienced or witnessed violence or harassment at school. 9 out of 10. Wow. It's crazy. The incidents are getting far more frequent. Teachers now report an average of 7 violent incidents a year.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. Some of the other, and there's a lot more stats like that in there. They're calling for, obviously, government action, right? They blame part of this, as our experts did as well, on growing class sizes, lack of resources, lack of mental health resources for students. So they kind of see it as a call to action. And not surprisingly, they're threatening. I don't know if threatening is the right word, but they're saying that safety is going to be their number one priority in the next round of negotiations.
Absolutely.
Right? They want some things to happen. So it's a great opportunity for us to revisit this conversation we had in September about. It's a great conversation about what's driving this change, why there's so much violence in schools, and what actually can we do today to try to curb those numbers. So we're going to listen to that conversation again.
Tonight on the show, we're joined by Joe Tigani, the president of the Ontario School Board Council of Unions, which, by the way, speaks for about 57,000 CUPE education workers across the province, including EAs, custodians, early childhood educators. And Darby Mallory is here, the co-author of a University of Ottawa report titled Running on Fumes, Violence, Austerity, and Institutional Neglect in Ontario Schools. Thanks to both of you for being here. Joe, I'd like to start with you first. Last month, Global News used a Freedom of Information legislation to uncover an alarming statistic. The number of violent incidents reported by school boards to the Ministry of Education has risen by 77% since Doug Ford took office, with more than 4,400 incidents reported in the 2023-24 school year alone. What's your reaction to those numbers?
Well, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised in the least. The interesting and the most alarming is the 75%, because that number, I think, can really be extrapolated across the province. The reported number of 4,400 or 4,400 and some odd number is actually low. That's a number that they used through that Freedom of Information around specific types of violent incidents that are reporting. Because when you drill down and take the number of school days divided by the number of boards, although that number sounds high, that's actually not really very high. The alarming piece is the rise, which probably can be connected across all school boards and all types of violence. So I'm not surprised in the least. We've seen that over the last several years, where there just has been a consistent increase of violent incidents. It's alarming. It's concerning. I'm not at all surprised by that number. Like I said, the 75% is what's really eye-opening and should be very alarming to people in Ontario.
Darby, let's bring you into the conversation. You were the lead author on a recent University of Ottawa research report that nearly 6,000 education sector workers in the province, when it comes to violence, what did those workers tell you specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So this research is coming out of a national survey that we did in the fall a couple of years ago. And what I think is most striking and what we all need to take note of is, like Joe said, that this is a pervasive issue. Something like 4,400 unique instances of violence being reported is a low number. On average, our respondents had reported 22 and a half unique instances of violence from students, administrators, colleagues, and parents during a single school year. Wow. And, over 80% of respondents had, in fact, experienced at least one unique instance. So talking about the vast majority of people experiencing, witnessing, and being around violence in schools.
Can you give us some examples, Darby? What kind of violence are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of student-initiated acts, attempts, and threats of physical force, we're talking about a huge range of behaviors. Things like water bottles being thrown across a classroom towards an education sector worker, people being bitten, hit, kicked, slapped. We're also seeing things like, physical acts that are threatening in nature. So people being, shown behaviors that would insinuate harm being attempted. In terms of other things, we're seeing a lot of swearing, a lot of pervasive and discriminatory language being used, overt and covert racism being deployed by students in the classroom against different types of education sector workers, and lots of different behaviors that are known to be discriminatory in nature.
Joe, what's driving all this violence?
Well, it's ironic listening to what Darby just said and going back to your initial question. That's the type of data that's not being reported in that number of 4,400, right? As alarming as that information was in that number, all of those pieces that she alluded to would make that number astronomical. And boards have that data. That's just not something that they're reporting the same way, by the way, which Global got that information. So what's contributing to this? A lot of things. I think we have a Ford government who has not kept up with the funding required to support students in Ontario. They may say they've had record investment. They can say that, till they're blue in the face. The reality is, in schools, we're not in a better place than we were 7 years ago when this government took power. We have less education workers to support all different types of students and those student needs. And they're very different, very complex needs. And as Darby alluded to, there's a lot of different pieces of that. Having more people in schools to help would help mitigate some of those things before they happen. So we could actually cut those things off before we end up in a crisis situation in our schools. And unfortunately, that's become the norm. We have crisis after crisis, fire after fire in classrooms across the province. But unfortunately, we need to see a real investment in frontline education workers in Ontario.
Darby, this is an obvious question, but how is all these incidents impacting the people who are on the front lines and doing this work?
Yeah, I think that's part of what's really devastating about this is that going to work every single day, experiencing or witnessing violence has become the reality and what's normal for most education sector workers across Ontario. And I would go so far as to say across Canada. So I think there's inevitably a huge impact on workers. People are disillusioned with the lack of impact that is going on. And as a result, they're less likely to report, which, as Joe said, is really coming out in the data that's been able to be accessed by Global News. And I think that that's what we're seeing. Not only are people being physically impacted by the injuries, illnesses, having to take time off work to cope with an injury they've sustained in the workplace, but there's also the mental injury that is caused by going to work every single day and experiencing violence, being told that this is part of your job description, being told that there's no solutions available to help mitigate or manage the violence, and being expected to continue to face it every single day with no end in sight. But beyond that, we know that these education sector workers are parents, their spouses, their family members. These people are going home having experienced violence in the workplace on an almost daily basis and carrying the troubles of that home. They may be exhausted. They may be too tired to, hang out with their own children. And I think that that's an impact that's often overlooked. And on top of that, we know that nobody learns in a classroom that's full of violence. Other students who are witnessing violence, who are being told that violence against primarily women education sector workers is normal, that's super problematic and something that we should all be paying more attention to.
Darby, I'll stay with you on that point. As things get worse, it's almost like there's a sense that it's becoming normalized, as in, well, it's just a part of the job now. Your comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's certainly something that has happened. The vast majority of education sector workers we interviewed and surveyed over the last couple of years spoke about the ubiquity of the violence and how that's become normalized. So like Joe was saying, there's a huge underreporting issue. And that's just the simple reality of the fact that when somebody experiences multiple incidents of violence on a daily basis at work, they can't be expected to take time during their personal day after work when they finally leave the workplace to report 12 different instances using 4 forms for each instance. It's just unmanageable. And I think that that really speaks to the way that it's becoming normalized. Of course, there are instances that are absolutely being reported, but I think that I would go so far as to say that those are the most severe instances. The daily sort of hitting, slapping, kicking, those little maybe more minor in terms of behaviors are not often being reported. And more we see that those are being framed by administrators as just, a small behavioral issue. They swipe it under the rug and expect that it's not going to need to be dealt with, because they are coping with the reality that schools are vastly understaffed and vastly underfunded, and they just simply can't keep up with the amount of issues that are happening in the classrooms on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. We talk about resources. Joe, do you have numbers on, are there actually fewer EAs in classrooms now than there were, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there are less, but there are more needs, right? The diverse needs that we see in our schools now, we haven't kept up with the demand, right? We know more about, we actually are better prepared as a society to help support students. Unfortunately, we don't have the funding to get boots on the ground in schools to help support these students that are coming into our schools. A great example of this is we often look at COVID. COVID became this really bizarre, element in our life. You would think coming out of COVID, when we could have predicted there would be some odd social behaviors from all generations, not just kids, but kids in particular that really struggled being at home, not seeing their friends. Like, they just had such a different existence for that period of time. You would think you would have doubled down as a government to try and find a way to invest and make sure that those kids had the right pieces in place for them moving forward. But there really wasn't. There was, a focus on cleaning protocols, and that was important. Don't get me wrong. But we forgot about all of these little people, especially transitioning into school, but also kids from, grade 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all of them that basically were off the grid, were unable to communicate, didn't have any social or human interaction. It was such a weird time, and we have not really got back to where we needed to with putting investment into our schools. So, I think there's a real solution. Yeah, it's investing in frontline education workers in the province of Ontario to make sure that the right supports are in place to help these kids that really they're not doing anything wrong, right? That's the one thing I really need to point out, that they come to school to learn, and we need to try and figure out how to best support them in that process.
You make a great point about the lingering effects of COVID, and then you worry about how much of that still lingers. You're absolutely correct. Darby, what struck me too about your research report was the stat that nearly half of respondents experienced parent-initiated harassment, which really concerns me as a parent of 2 kids in school. What's driving that? And I mean, that's just that half of workers would have that interaction. That's scary.
Yeah, and it's absolutely something that appears to be new in our data. We've always asked about parents, other workers, and administrators just to gauge sort of the entirety of the situation. But the fact that almost half of respondents have experienced at least one instance of parent harassment with an average of over 4 is certainly striking information. I think there's many things that are going on for sure. I think that we have seen a public rhetoric over the last 10 to 20 years that has truly villainized education sector workers as having it all. And as a result, parents have been, coaxed by this sort of political rhetoric to think that these people are there to serve them. And I think that there's a real disconnect between the old days where parents worked with education sector workers and knew that these people have the best intentions. They're there to help their children, everyone's children, learn, grow, and achieve all of their dreams. And I think that this sort of idea that education sector workers don't have the best intentions has been used by political people to try to help mitigate some of the professionalization of workers. We've also seen, rhetoric, very anti-union rhetoric over the last 10 to 5 years. We see the ways that this whole, delegitimization of professionals has become so pervasive. And this idea that we can't trust professionals is really becoming clear in schools. On the other hand, I also think that parents are frustrated. I think that there are lots of parents who go into schools every day to drop their kids off and see that their kids are not getting the support that they need. And I do think that is absolutely legitimate, but it doesn't, of course, legitimize the way that they're taking that frustration out on education sector workers themselves. So I think there's sort of two parts. There's, a complicated mix of things, but I think we need to help refocus the agenda and say, we're all working on the same page. We all need to be mobilizing with unions to help try to get more funding in schools, more staff in schools, and more resources for all students who need them.
Joe, this may be the most obvious of questions, but how does all of this impact student learning and well-being?
Yeah, with violent incidents in classes, in schools up, it disrupts learning. So every time there is a disruption in a classroom, whether that means a classroom needs to be vacated because the student might be in crisis, it's impacting students every single day. We have, Darby alluded to it, we have a massive recruitment and retention issue. So we have insufficient supports now. And when we have people that are away that can't be replaced because people aren't going to come in and do that work anymore because it's no longer desirable to come in and potentially be a punching bag in a school setting when you're coming in and going to deal with that level of violence. We're talking about, and I'm sure if we had more time, we could get into specific testimonials that I'm sure, would break your heart. And Darby could allude to the different things that I'm sure that they've read. People, the level of exposure of violence that people are subjected to is that of like first responders, police, jail guards. Like that's the type of violence that we're seeing in schools that it's not being reported properly. It's not being captured. It's not being articulated. So it kind of goes back to when you come into a school, the people that are there are doing everything in their power to care for your children. Their hands are often tied, sometimes one hand behind their back, sometimes two hands behind their back because they don't have enough resources. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough people in the building to properly support. So that's what we see. You have you put little Jimmy or Sally on the bus and you think they're going to school and having just that perfect day. There's that communication breakdown in the home. Like, how often do parents ask their children, how was your day? What happened? You might be awfully surprised if you engaged in a conversation as a family. And that's even a challenge now, right? Families are busy. Everyone's going in different directions. They got different sports and activities and everybody's, scheduled to the max. But if you took the time to sit down and have a conversation with your kids, I think you might be shocked at the level of interruption, the level of insufficient support that they witness, depending on their age. They're able to see, wow, we didn't get to go to the library today because the library was closed because there's no person to open the library today. That's the type of thing that just doesn't get captured well enough. And I think we as a school system, we as educators, we're ringing the alarm. We're sounding it loud, saying something needs to change. We are at a breaking point in the province of Ontario. Something needs to change, and it needs to change now.
It's a great transition, Joe. Because Darby, I think it was your report that mentioned how workplace violence in Ontario schools remains the best kept secret. Is that starting to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is certainly more recognition. I think that unions have been mobilizing on this issue for far longer than we have been researching this issue. But, our survey in late 2022 was the first national survey to look at this issue. So I think there's still absolutely room for growth. But like Joe said, we have the last page in our report is called Parents Need to Know, because it truly is a best kept secret. I mean, I'm sure there are education sector workers that roll their eyes and say, we've been talking about this for 10 to 15 years. Yeah. Absolutely. But I think that the normalization of violence and evacuations and chaos in the learning environment is also happening among the youngest learners. Many students are not going home and saying, my classroom was evacuated for the 50th time this year, because it's becoming normal to them. And so I think that's part of why we're trying to, spread the word and support union mobilization in those efforts, so that people really do understand the complexity of schools now. The truth of the matter is that schools just simply are not the same as they were 20 years ago.
Can I just add something to that?
Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
And even a government that's driven by EQAO data or results, that type of information, those interruptions impact learning. And no one could ever try and say that it doesn't. So by investing in education supports to mitigate those, you would actually see an increase in EQAO data. And trust me, I'm not a fan or proponent of that data as a method by which we should use, but I'm saying a government that often uses those numbers, an investment in this actually would pay dividends for them later on. So they could actually have a investment and what it looks like at the end. But again, this is a government that doesn't want to do that. They're simply looking for a way to starve the system, ultimately, in my humble opinion, to look to ways to prioritize it. And the rich will enjoy a lovely education system, and those that are not will struggle.
We see it, Joe, now. I think it's 5 school boards in Ontario that have been taken over by the provincial government. They're saying that this is the best way forward for those boards. They want to get them back on track, quote unquote, I believe is the term. Will that do anything to help the workplace violence issue, the way this Conservative government is moving on taking over school boards?
Absolutely not. I mean, by taking over school boards is going to have no impact on school violence whatsoever. You're going to have one appointed person coming in from the government to govern or run the school board. You have elected trustees now who are basically silent. So even as a parent, how do you have a conversation with someone to get your message across to the board? This is simply the Ford government's way of silencing the elected people, the trustees that you and I elect in our community to be our voice at the school board level. So I don't think it's going to have anything. If anything, it's going to make things worse.
Can I just add that?
Go ahead, Dara.
Sorry, thank you.
No problem.
I just want to say also, we talk a lot about structural violence and institutional neglect and the way that this lack of funding is actually causing violence. And I think that the rhetoric around, overspending and inappropriate spending is also being used to obscure important information about challenges that schools are facing. So instead of acknowledging that schools are struggling because they've been underfunded for the last 20 years, we say, there's certain, trustees that have overspent, and that's why your students don't have resources. It's sort of just a scapegoat instead of facing the real truth. And that's that schools are desperately in need of funding so that they can adequately staff classrooms and provide resources for students.
All right, and that is where we shall end it. The bell has rung. Joe Tagani and Darby Mowry, thank you both for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Always great to look back on those important conversations. And coming up tomorrow, a very important and relevant one with Matthew Holmes. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief of Public Policy for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. This discussion on the heels of the U.S. Supreme Court and their ruling on the Trump tariffs.
Yeah, I know, and you actually reached out to the Chamber last week, so this took a bit of time. They're obviously extremely busy over there, but they gave us a slot for Friday, which is great. So much to talk about. I'm looking forward to just going back in time and just talking about the early days of these tariff announcements and what we've learned as a country about where we have to go from, when it comes to the economy. Yeah. There's so many changes that have to be made. And as we know, and other guests have talked about on this show, we did get comfortable knowing that we could sell to the Americans, right?
sure.
I think of Peter Dinalo, who was on. Remember when he came on to talk
yeah.
John Chrétien's former chief of staff or former communications director, right? He talked about how later in life when he was a consultant for companies, he admitted that Canadians would always pitch Canada as, hey, come set up shop here. We're right over the border from America. You have access to all the market you need over there. And that's changed. Where we live in a different world. So where do we go from here is the key question. And obviously the Chamber, they've been pretty consistent in they're upset with just the on again, off again of this whole trade war, right? That every day it's a yo-yo. Every day it's a new decision, and they've been open about that, and saying that we need to lobby hard for a new deal, a new trade deal with America that's at least gives us some consistency, and get rid of this kind of yo-yo that we're going through, right? But also at the same time that we have to diversify, that there are other markets we need to look to besides America. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. Somebody who knows the issues inside and out. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be good to get some insight as to what maybe we can see down the road 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year from now. Okay, that's tomorrow night right here on Closer Look. That's our time for this evening. Tonight's show is always produced by Derek Turner. For Michael Friscolanti, I'm Scott Sexsmith. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow night at 7 right here on Closer Look.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.